The Hairstons were one of the wealthiest families of the Old South. How wealthy? At their financial peak, they owned 40 plantations and 10,000 people. The descendants of those slaves are now a huge family scattered across America, and yet they still have a powerful connection to each other and to the plantations where their ancestors toiled. All families have their disagreements. Sometimes the issues are personal, sometimes political. In that respect, the Hairstons are no different than most American families. But if it's taking them a little longer to sort things out, that's understandable, because for a very long time, one side of the family owned the other side. At one time, the Hairstons, or Hairstons as the white side of the family pronounces it, were the Rockefellers of the Old South. They owned not one, but dozens of plantations and thousands of slaves, most of whom also took the name Hairston. The descendants of those slaves are now a huge family scattered across America, and yet they still have a powerful connection to each other and to the plantations where their ancestors toiled. We begin by introducing you to some members of a remarkable family. Judge Hairston was the first African-American to conduct the Mormon Tabernacle Choir.
Oh, yeah. Sound like white folks.
For most of this century, he's been teaching white folks and black folks to sing spirituals the way his grandmother sang them as a slave on a Hairston plantation in North Carolina.
Second baseman, number 39, Judge Hairston.
When Judge Hairston stepped up to the plate last season, the Hairstons stepped into the history books as the first black family to play Major League Baseball for 3 generations. His father and his grandfather also played in the majors. Everly Hairston, a sharecropper's daughter and veteran of the civil rights marches,
My name is Everly Hairston.
now lobbies in Washington for the rights of the blind.
So family has always been important.
Oh, extremely important.
Why?
Well, because my grandfather wanted us to bond. He said it was important to know who you are and know who your family is. The whites were our family too, really, but it wasn't talked about.
For the Hairstons, family is serious business. So serious, they're incorporated. The annual reunion of the National Hairston Clan, Inc. looks more like a convention. There are ministers and musicians, doctors and lawyers, big city bankers and small-town barbers. And there are flag-waving patriots like World War II veteran Joe Henry Hairston.
When you meet all these Hairstons, you got nuts, you got saints, you got beautiful people, you got ugly people, but they're all family.
Your grandparents was a Hairston? What plantation?
Not all of these Hairstons are connected by blood, but they are all connected by sweat and tears. They are named Hairston primarily because their ancestors worked on plantations owned by one of the biggest names in slavery. When American history writer Henry Winsick was researching a book on plantations, he was invited to a Hairston reunion.
There were nearly 1,000 people there. I was just amazed at the strength of family feeling that could bring so many people together from so many distant places. And I wondered, where did that family strength come from, and where were the roots of that gathering? Did it go back all the way to slavery? And that's where it did go.
This family so intrigued him that he spent the next 8 years delving into its history. The result is his book, The Hairstons, An American Family in Black and White.
Hairston.
When Henry Winsick discovered this faded document buried in the deed room of a county courthouse, he finally understood why Hairstons turn out in droves for today's family reunions.
Over 700 Hairstons appeared that day.
That was the day in 1866 when the government finally allowed former slaves to register their marriages and the names of their children. That also was the day they could choose a family name. Many of them chose the name Hairston.
The real significance of this document is that this is a symbol of their victory over slavery. The white people very often believe that slaves could not hold marriages together, and this document proves them wrong.
Overwhelmingly proves them
Overwhelmingly.
wrong.
Why did the Hairston family survive a system designed to tear families apart? The answer lies in another document, the Hairston family slave ledgers, what Henry Winsick calls the bank books of human souls. The Hairstons believed in the old Scottish maxim, money is flat and meant to be piled up. So for generations, they never sold land and almost never sold off their slaves, leaving the slave families intact. This mansion is one of the last vestiges of what once was a vast empire stretching from Virginia to Mississippi. The Hairstons were one of the wealthiest families of the Old South. How wealthy? At their financial peak, they owned 40 plantations and 10,000 people. And nearly 200 years after a Peter Hairston bought this land,
I'm Peter Hairston.
It's very nice to meet you.
I'm glad to see you.
there's still a Peter Hairston living on this plantation.
Do you remember the first time a black person was allowed to come in through that front door?
Very well indeed, and I even can tell you who it was. Old William.
Old William, who was a servant on the plantation and who also was Everly Hairston's grandfather. The judge remembers that occasion so well because he let old William in. As a serious scholar of Southern history and the self-appointed guardian of the family's extensive archives, Judge Peter helped the black Hairstons trace their roots. He spent years compiling information on the slaves his family owned.
Okay, come on, Ann.
And he's been welcoming black Hairstons through the front door for a very long time.
I think that for much of his adult life, he has quietly been trying to atone for what his grandfather and his farther ancestors did. But he would never tell you that, and he would certainly never told me that. But I can see it in what he did.
But if this is looking like one big happy family, it's not. Everly Hairston deeply resents how her family was treated.
You were born on a plantation.
Yes. Born and raised on the plantation.
Everly lost her eyesight in her 20s, but she's always managed to find her way. Her grandparents, William and Charmin, were the house servants. Her parents were sharecroppers, and Everly hated every cotton-picking minute.
I leaned forward to pick this cotton out of the cotton ball, and I saw this long black snake. I started yelling and screaming, and then I looked around. There was another one, another one. We all ran until we reached the end of the cotton row. And when I got to the top of the bags of cotton, I just sat there, started crying with my head in my hands and saying, oh God, there has to be a better way of life.
She's a northerner now, and yet she keeps going back to that plantation, this time with her son, because like it or not, it's home.
Well, that's where I was born.
And she visits the judge, who's now 87 and recovering from a stroke, because like it or not, he's family.
But Daddy told me to say hello to you.
But at a recent reunion when Judge Peter Hairston was an invited guest of honor, Everly shocked hundreds of Hairstons by publicly accusing him of mistreating her family.
What came over you?
The truth. When I started thinking about the day that I sat on those bags of cotton and thought about how much I hated the fact that we were working our heads off on somebody else's land for such a very, very little pay. It was crazy. It was so unfair.
Historian Henry Winsick was there taking notes.
A silence fell over the crowd because no one had ever publicly spoken to the judge that way before. Then there was a round of applause because she had cut through sort of decades of encrusted politeness and decorum to say, you could have done more for us.
But that wasn't the end of it. Everly went back to the plantation.
He greeted me at the door and said, "Come on in, young lady, I have to talk to you." I thought, I don't quite like this tone. He said, we had lived a very good life on the plantation. And I told him, you can continue to believe that, but it's not true.
And he said?
I treated William and Charming quite well, Everly. They didn't and couldn't do any better for themselves. It was like a knife piercing in my heart. I said, perhaps they couldn't, or perhaps you made them think that they couldn't, but I know differently.
She speaks her piece and I speak mine.
You thought you had done right by her parents and her grandparents.
May not have done altogether right. Nobody ever does.
But, as he points out, he is the Hairston who ended sharecropping on the plantation.
You're still friends with him?
Yes,
You still care about him?
I do.
Why?
Well, because I'm concerned about his welfare. He's a human being. He's probably my cousin.
She means it. They could be cousins. She knows her light skin comes from having white ancestors. She just doesn't know which ones. Joe Henry Hairston has always wondered about his light skin, too. It's the legacy of slavery that he sees in the mirror every day.
We can see we don't look like our original descendants from West Africa. So it's obvious something happened in the interim.
So isn't it that obvious to the white Hairstons?
Well, it should be, but you have the traditions of the South, which to some respects is still in denial.
This is Joseph Henry Hairston's family.
In an amazing bit of detective work, Henry Winsek traced Joe Henry's roots back to a slave named Sal, purchased in 1785 for a barrel of tobacco. This is the receipt for her. The frugal Hairstons kept careful track of their property. From a family will, he figured out that the Peter Hairston who died in 1832 had children by this slave named Sal, which means that the great-great-great-grandfather of the judge is also the great-great-great-grandfather of Joe Henry.
Well, we were property, and so masters used their property.
Have you talked with him about this at all?
I consider Judge Peter a friend, a very good friend, and a very fine person. But these are things you don't talk about in polite society in the South.
Our cameras were there a few months ago when the judge was telling the historian there wasn't enough evidence to prove he's related to Joe Henry Hairston.
It seems a lot clearer to me, but we can certainly agree to disagree.
At first you didn't believe this.
No, wait a minute. I didn't say I didn't believe it. I've never said that. I said I didn't think there was sufficient evidence of it.
That sounds very judicial.
Well, maybe it was.
And Joe Henry, who's also an attorney, at first shared the judge's skepticism about their blood ties.
Now, that doesn't mean that I deny what's before your eyes. Obviously, I believe there's a whole lot of connection in a whole lot of places.
And recently, the judge did a little investigating of his own.
And I've learned from my brother that he had had a conversation with an ancient cousin of ours, that indeed it was probably true.
Now the family secret is out, and the judge has a new cousin, Joe Henry Hairston.
I'm prouder to be kin to Joe Henry than to anybody else I know.
Judge, see you the next time.
My friend, cousin Joe.
Yes, sir.
And Joe Henry has no hard feelings.
I am the product of my ancestors, whoever they were. My basic philosophy is not to hate. Hate is destructive.
The black and white Hairstons are connected by the worst evil in America's history, but they have not turned their backs on each other. Because like it or not, they are family. They share a name and a place and a history.
Do you feel like that plantation is partially yours?
I do in a way. The blood of my ancestors is on those plantations.